Hi, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I'm Daniel, and I'm running for state office for House District 22, Northeast Colorado Springs in the state of Colorado, to be a state representative. And one of the reasons why we're having these conversations is because we want to do this process the way it should have always been done. It's through conversations, talking with stakeholders, talking with the people that actually get affected by the laws and policies that are written. I've said this before, and I hope that it catches on at some point, that there's too big a gap between those who are elected and those who are affected. And so these conversations, we are bridging those gaps. We are releasing a series of conversations with and today it's conversations with someone who's worked in the service industry. It's a huge part of our Colorado economy. And yeah, Merritt, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
And well, you know what? Let's just start with the hard one, the elephant out the room, the economy.
Yeah.
Inflation, housing costs. I have a lot of friends who work in the service industry. What is that like? And maybe start with how long have you been in the service industry? And what's that like working in the service industry? And then also housing in Colorado Springs.
I've worked in the service industry for like 4 to 5 years, primarily as a bartender. I was a career bartender for a little bit. Now I do more of the admin, back of house part of it, but still working in the restaurant industry. As lucrative as bartending can be, when you live in a state with inflation and housing costs like we live in, it's still a very hard industry to be a part of. People, I think, sometimes get this perception that when the costs at the restaurants go up, that all ends up in the back pocket of the bartenders and waiters and waitresses.
Wait, you mean you don't get on the inflation?
No,
okay.
No, we don't get on. We don't get any increase in our wages when inflation goes up. Most of the time, when restaurant costs go up, menu prices go up, it does not. It actually makes it worse for the waiting staff because we don't. The reason they had to increase the costs is because food costs went up. And rent costs go up.
So the increase is going to food. It's not necessarily going
absolutely. And while you could make the argument that your tipping probably goes up a little bit too, that might be true. But also, people aren't going out as much because of the cost of inflation right now.
Right.
And
well, even the tipping, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in the national conversation has been, tipping culture.
Yep.
And how people are pushing back at that because everywhere you go, it's like, oh, would you like to leave a tip? No pressure.
Yep.
Here's the iPad. Here's the iPad.
Yep.
And so people do have a more again, the assumption that inflation goes up and that ends up getting to you may not really be the case.
No, and more often than not, it's not. And again, when inflation comes up and people are tightening their purses, their wallets, and they're looking for ways looking for ways to ease their monthly budgetary spending. One of the first things to get cut out usually is going out to eat, going out to drink. As somebody in the industry who loves bartending, one of the first things that I usually cut back on if I'm looking to save money is going out.
Right.
Because
somewhere Dave Ramsey is really proud of you, but in that,
but it's hard. And so when you're in the industry and you're living in a city with rising home costs, rising rent costs, I have buddies that are renting right now that are it's almost as expensive to rent here as it would be up in Denver. They could get a really nice spot near downtown Denver, walking distance to a lot of great places. And they're like, it's only a little bit more expensive.
Well, and that's profound because honestly,
Springs.
I remember in choosing where to live for myself, I chose Colorado Springs over Denver because, and I'm a bit of a data nerd. Just get that out of the way.
Yep.
But I had a spreadsheet of all these different options, and Denver was $400 to $500 more expensive on average in terms of housing costs, and for that to have changed. That's
we're getting closer and closer to Denver numbers.
And I'm going to ask a personal question, mainly because I like asking personal questions, and you're a friend, so hey, let's make you uncomfortable on camera. Is for housing costs, inflation, working a job that does have a seasonal income, how family planning? You're married, happily married, but how does that impact then what it means to start a family here in Colorado Springs?
Well, it's on hold. My wife and I have talked about like, oh, what, do we want kids? Yeah, we want kids, but I grew up in a very low income family, and I understand the importance of having a disposable income and being, planning for a family and being able to have money in savings. And so there's a certain, we just, after 2 years of living in a basement, we finally were able to save up enough money to purchase a house, and now we've got to remodel the house because the house is, kind of old and needs some updating and stuff like that. And it's, it's like, well, we're going to spend a bunch of savings on that. And, people are already asking us, oh, when are you going to have kids?
Oh,
when are you going to fill the house with kids? And it's like,
and here I'm doing it on camera,
yeah,
no less.
probably not until we've waited another year or so and built our savings back up, because kids are expensive. Yeah. Daycare is expensive, and I only know how expensive it is because my brother has kids and he's had to pay for daycare, and he's told me daycare costs, and I sit there and go, wow, that's some people's rent. You're paying
mortgage.
Rent costs, or another mortgage cost.
Because
I
just
have your kid looked
on
after.
average, it's like $1,400 to $1,700 a month.
Yeah,
and I think that's low. But that thing, and thank you for letting me ask the personal question, because I think part of these conversations, the purpose is to shed light on what it really is across different sectors. Because what can state officials do? What can any elected official do to address that? But I think we first need to start with the need to address that.
Yeah.
And we need people to start families here in Colorado. We need there to be. I've shared with a few people the economic data nerd part comes out, but next year the largest crest of baby boomers, I believe, retires. Mm-hmm. So we have a huge group of people leaving the workforce, about to retire, and we have a huge number of people entering the workforce, but that offset, or the offset of incomes, that impacts Social Security, that impacts how our economy is. And so, frankly, we need you to succeed. Yeah. But there's some real considerations into what it means to start a family and buy a home and afford daycare here in Colorado.
Yeah, and it's not cheap. And when you sit there and go, wow, daycare costs almost as much as your monthly income costs. Well, what's the point in having a job then? You may as well just stay home and only one of you works.
And
but when you think about that line of thought process, it's like, well, can we survive on one income? Like, I know on the one hand we're saving on the daycare costs, but can we make it work on just one income when you have a mortgage? Food costs keep going up. Eggs
the inflation is not just going up for the people coming to the restaurant; it's going up for you too.
Yeah,
what scares me is that this conversation is not just happening with people in service industry, teachers.
Yep.
First responders.
Yep.
Nurses.
Yep.
And I met educators who have 2 jobs. Yep. And that to me is wild, because to be an educator is a 50, 60-hour week job. Yep. And then they have to get a second job. Yep. Like, I know a nurse, and her second job is a bartender. Yep. And these things, like, we have to have a really honest conversation that, economies work when everyone has opportunity and everyone succeeds, because at some point, you pay into the economic benefit for someone else. Yep. Someone else, them opening up a business provides economic benefit to you, and so we kind of need everyone to win.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. What questions? And I've been in these conversations. What would you like to ask of me, someone who's applying to be, basically we're working to represent you, so it's kind of like we're doing this big job interview. The election process is hey, would you hire me to be your representative? But what would you like to ask of anyone running for office or your elected officials that would really directly connect back to the service industry?
I guess, how do we create avenues for small businesses to succeed better? How do we create avenues for more affordable housing? I know Yemi is working on that, but what are areas of zoning laws that need to change so that we can have more apartment buildings and one-unit family household in neighborhoods? I know that there's a giant scare of apartments going up in your local neighborhood because you think it's going to affect your property value, but how do we get homeowners to realize that people people need to live in your neighborhood. They need to not, we need to have affordable apartments in nicer neighborhoods and not just luxury apartments, places so people can get out of neighborhoods into nicer neighborhoods, have access to schools, jobs, all those opportunities that come from being in a nicer place, and that it shouldn't be exclusionary, oh, well, if you can't afford a home over here, then you don't deserve to live over here. Like, that's such a selfish outlook to have, instead of looking for opportunities to create nicer apartments for people so that your local bartender who lives in your neighborhood can afford to be there, instead of having to commute to his job bartending
I would
from
like
far
a neighborhood
away.
with no bartenders, though.
Yeah.
I just absolutely not. You cannot live near me. But that's
Well,
but
then your coffee baristas, then they
Right.
should be able to
Well,
afford a
and-
nice apartment in a nice part of.
And I think this is, and I'm purely joking. Hopefully the
Yeah.
sarcasm comes through. But I think this is to go in that order of what can we do for small businesses. We start with what small businesses need.
Yep.
And to rechange, small business can include anything from a 2-person business to a 100-person business.
Absolutely.
And so finding ways to say, a 10-person family-owned small business is not going to have the same economic ability or impact as a 200-person business or a 100-person business or even a 50-person business. And so to go, how do we honor those differences? How do we make sure there's tax breaks and benefits for small businesses, not just large businesses? I think we need to look at that. And on the housing side, and this I'm a huge nerd on, because really in the language of housing, what people are most concerned about is when it's like, okay, well, are you going to build a homeless shelter next to my neighborhood?
Yeah.
And I can understand those concerns because,
Yeah.
if you worked hard to buy a home and then you're concerned about your property values or crime, that is a real consideration. But in housing, we have, you think Section 8, you have affordable, and there's this category called attainable housing.
Yeah.
And I think this is where we need to have the conversations when it comes to attainable housing. This is housing that, the missing middle, if you've heard that before.
Yep.
Where do your teachers buy?
Yep.
Because if your teachers cannot afford a mortgage in Colorado Springs, we're in trouble.
Yep.
If a teacher, to be able to afford a mortgage, has to live with roommates or be married to live, these are the things that, congratulations, just buying a home.
Yeah.
That's huge. But we know that in America, home ownership is one of the best paths to wealth building.
Yep.
And we want people to own homes, and that doesn't have to look like, and frankly, I'm not a big fan of like 30-story apartment buildings. Like, I like my view of the mountain, but what I would love to see, I think Chapel Hills Mall, honestly, what they did, the parking lot, you have all these unused parking spaces. You know what? A 3-story apartment complex, or townhomes or multi-mix, and you have really beautiful shops that are locally owned on the first floor, and then townhomes where people live above. There are beautiful, responsible ways that are economically viable, and they offer opportunity for people starting off and family planning to have attainable housing. We need to have that conversation because, as well, and this is me rambling a bit, but you want teachers, first responders, and you want people to work and live near each other. When people, let's say, and I've seen this before, first responder works in Colorado Springs, but they have to drive from Fountain or further south to be able to make it to their place of work. One, that adds traffic, and no one wants traffic. No one wants extra cars on the road, and we do need cars, but having someone drive 30 minutes to work doesn't help traffic. But also, when especially police officers and teachers, when they live in the neighborhoods they serve, that tremendously impacts public safety, the beauty of a neighborhood, and. Gosh, we appreciate you. During COVID, it was service industry work members that they're showing up when, in a time where it is just not a fun, easy time to work in food or work. This is going to sound kind of, but God bless all those Costco workers and everyone that they had to put up with. All of us showing up in long lines to get toilet paper, and the impact on this industry. And there's a lot of people in this industry that we need to do better to say, what do you need? How do we support you? How do we get you to get to the next stage of your life where you can afford a home, start a family, no pressure,
Yeah.
and pay into Social Security.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Well, Merritt, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
You're a friend, so this makes this conversation
Yeah.
super easy. Glad we could be a joke, and hopefully no one misreads sarcasm.
Yeah, no, you're good.
Sarcasm is a thing. But seriously, thank you for being part of these conversations. This is what I love about this process. Right now, we are knocking on doors, getting signatures to be on the ballot. I'm an unaffiliated, so we turn in 1,000 signatures to be on the ballot, and literally we have knocked on 2,500 doors already just in the last week and a half, and we're knocking on more. No other candidate in this race is working this hard to make sure that you get to know me, that we get to know our community members and our community leaders, and that we're having a conversation that isn't just to get elected, it's to write good policy and law once elected. So thank you so much. Daniel for Colorado.com. Can volunteer, find out more information, engage with us, but thank you so much for being a part. And Merritt, dude, thank you so much.
Absolutely.